Welcome. As mentioned, my name's Rachel Hayes. I'm the Consents and ESG Policy Manager at Solar Energy UK, and we're really excited to be delivering this series of workshops on solar developments in collaboration with PAS. So for today's agenda, we will have the welcome introductions, which we are currently in the process of doing. There'll be an overview of the workshops, as this is the first session, just to give you an idea of what you can expect in this session and indeed the following sessions. Then we'll be welcoming Rich Jones, Director at Quad, to be giving a presentation around sort of consenting regimes for solar developments. And then we'll open up to a wider Q&A session where I'll be joined with some of the leading experts in the industry to answer some of your questions. So as Gareth was saying, please do use Slido throughout this session and we can get those questions lined up in time for the Q&A. So just to give a brief overview of who we are, so it feels like there's sort of a mixed bag here, some people familiar with PAS and Solar Energy UK, some not. So the Planning Advisory Service, they're supporting local planning authorities to provide effective planning services and are working with national and local government to help implement changes in the planning system. And Solar Energy UK, so we're the trade association for solar and storage companies in the UK. We're a non-for-profit who are funded by our members, and we are lucky enough to have a really diverse set of members. So everybody from your sort of residential and commercial installers through to solar farm developers, lawyers, ecologists, academia. Really fortunate that we have this wide breadth of expertise within our membership. So together, our ambition is to empower the solar transformation and pave the way for the UK to deliver 50 gigawatts of solar by 2030 and 70 gigawatts of solar by 2035. And we really recognise that in order for us to achieve those levels of deployment in line with our net zero and climate targets, we will need to work collaboratively. That's within our industry, across wider industries, but also within local and national government as well. So to give a very brief overview of these workshops, so today is the first in a series of 6 workshops that we're co-hosting with PAS, and we'll be running these across September and October, so starting today and ending on the 10th. These workshops we've designed for local planners and associated planning professionals who are perhaps interested and or responsible for determining ground-mounted solar farm planning applications. So each of these sessions will cover a key issue or a topic that we believe to be relevant to local planning authorities. And these have largely been selected off of Solar Energy UK's recently published solar fact sheets and position statements. So far we've published position statements on archaeology and fact sheets on agriculture and site selection, and we also intend to publish a fact sheet on batteries imminently, so please watch out for that one. So across the next 6 weeks, we'll be looking at those topics in turn alongside biodiversity as well. And the final session of solar farms and batteries will also be complemented by an extended general sort of Q&A session. So if we find that during the sessions there's a lot of questions that we weren't able to answer that we wanted to, perhaps that will be another time we will be able to do so. So each session will kick off with a brief presentation, and then we'll have this interactive Q&A with representatives from the solar industry and, where possible, wider stakeholders. So, for example, at the next session around solar farms and agriculture, we'll be joined by a representative from the National Farmers Union in the Q&A session. And lastly, before I hand over to Rich, I think it's really important just to understand why we're doing these sessions. And I think we've organised these sessions to bring people together to discuss solar farm developments, the opportunities and potential challenges associated with them. But first and foremost, it's a chance for collaboration, and it's an opportunity for us to share expertise, both as the industry, both as local government. And we're really hoping that for local planners and sort of wider professionals working in the planning space, that these workshops will be helpful in supporting them to gain a fuller understanding of solar and storage technologies. But for the solar industry as well, this is a really good opportunity for us to learn from the experience of local planners and incorporate that expertise into the work that we're doing. So we're really hoping that these workshops will be as collaborative and as informative as possible for all involved. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Rich Jones, Director at Quad, to present on the big picture for solar developments, looking at TCPA and NSIP regimes. And just finally, a quick plea, if you do think of any questions throughout the presentation, please submit them through Slido and we'll pick them up in the Q&A session. So Rich, over to you.
Thanks, Rachel. So yeah, diving straight in. So as you will all be aware, one of the main things that we're working towards is the net zero target by 2050. And solar power has got a really important role in delivering that. So the government is aiming for fully decarbonised, reliable and low-cost power system by 2035, which would predominantly be consisting of wind and solar. And that includes a target of 50 gigawatts of solar by 2030, compared to where we stood as of March 2024, which is 15.8 gigawatts up and running. So that leaves, by my maths, about 35 gigawatts left to make operational by 2030, which is just over 5 years away. And then if you break that down, then it's at least 400 megawatts that needs to be switched on each and every month. So there's a real challenge there, but as planners, we love a challenge, and so yeah, we'll kind of talk you through what's required really. So just for context, apologies for those that are already well aware of this, but for solar farms, there's essentially two ways of getting consent. If you are under 50 megawatts, then it is a planning application, which of course is determined by the local planning authority. Once you're above a 50 megawatt threshold, then the project becomes nationally significant. It becomes known as an NSIP, a nationally significant infrastructure project, and a development consent order is needed, which is determined by the Secretary of State based on a recommendation from PINS, the Planning Inspectorate. We've also included here just a point on BESS, battery energy storage systems. They are sometimes co-located with solar farms, and so it's just really to make the point that there's no limit on the scale of BESS when you're making a planning application, but once you tip over the threshold into DCO, then the BESS needs to comply with the associated development guidance that exists on the PINS website, which has got a series of criteria. But effectively it needs to be subordinate to the main development. So the solar farm needs to remain the primary element. So I just thought it'd be useful to set out a little bit of context about where solar farms are typically being located across the UK. And this information has come from the government's renewable energy planning database. So between 5 and 50 megawatts, there's a large number of them that have been approved, constructed, or are in operation, over 650 of them. About 30% of those are down in the southwest, and then if you add together southwest, southeast, and eastern, then you end up with well over 50%. So there's a strong clustering of those more advanced schemes towards the southern parts of the UK. But then as you move towards the live applications and those that are pending, you can see that it's starting to shift. So there's now only 16% down in the southwest, with the highest proportion in the East Midlands and Yorkshire regions. So they're now seeing the most solar activity, and that's mainly due to where the main grid capacity is and the improving efficiency of the panels. So we're starting to see a much wider spread with increased use of solar farms all across the UK, notably just with the slight exception of Wales. But yeah, so it's a real spread that we're seeing now. So it's important to have this session. And then as you move beyond into the NSIP threshold, by our count, there's currently 36 that are currently in the public domain and on the infrastructure website. So that means that they have at least hit the environmental scoping stage. And as you can see, there's a starting to see some real kind of clustering there, particularly around East Midlands, Yorkshire and the Humber, but not exclusively so. And again, that's mainly coming down to where the grid capacity lies. So I just wanted to briefly turn towards policy and how that's affecting decision taking. So again, many of you will no doubt be aware of this, but if you are under 50 megawatt threshold and therefore seeking planning permission, then it's the development plan that takes primacy, with everything else being material consideration. Once you are over that threshold and you are into a development consent order, the process effectively becomes flipped. So the development plan becomes a material consideration, and it's the national policy statement, amongst other documents, that becomes primacy. So it's important to bear that in mind and be aware of the relevance of the relative relevance of the local plan through those different processes. And so given the importance of those varying ways that they can be considered, it's important to just pick out, I think, some of the fundamental differences insofar as they relate to solar between the NPPF and national policy statements. So taking green belts as an example, it's clear that many renewable energy projects are by definition classed as inappropriate development, and therefore VSCs, very special circumstances, are required. And on site selection relating to renewable energy, the focus of the NPPF is very much on the plan making stage. So it encourages local plans to plan positively for renewable and low carbon energy. But there's nothing specific in the NPPF itself on certain criteria where suitable sites haven't been identified within the local plan. So that is the kind of position of the NPPF on those two things. If we then turn to the next slide. Rachel, can you flick that on?
Sorry, it has gone to the next one for me. Let me try 1 second.
Oh, yes, that's come up now. Yeah, thank you.
Brilliant.
So in the national policy statements, which are recently adopted, they have now introduced what's known as the critical national priority, the CNP infrastructure policy, which essentially says that as long as there's no significant impacts on anything that might engage the habitats, regs, or might impact a marine conservation zone, an MCZ, and as long as the applicant is following the mitigation hierarchy, then in that instance, in all but the most exceptional circumstances, it's unlikely that consent will be refused. So obviously that's a very strong policy and different to the way that the NPPF is structured. And so it then goes on to give some further detail on that. And so under a DCO scheme, the starting point is that the following tests would be met, assuming that you've adhered to the first bullet point. So for Greenbelt, no requirement to demonstrate VSCs. If you've got a triple SI or indeed other sort of similar designations, no need to demonstrate that the benefits are clearly outweighing the impact. Nationally designated landscape, no requirement to demonstrate exceptional circumstances, and heritage assets, no need to demonstrate that any harm or loss is exceptional or wholly exceptional. So that is obviously very strong, but very important to note that this policy applies if the mitigation hierarchy has been followed. So you still need to demonstrate that you've sought to avoid, reduce, mitigate, and if possible, compensate for any effects. So it's by no means carte blanche. But worth being aware of. And then on the site selection side, so whilst the NPPF is very much plan making focused, site selection has some useful criteria in it about elements that could be considered or should be considered when you're looking at where individual sites are located. So I won't go through the list there, but you can see there's a range of different aspects that are important. And then so very briefly on to the main considerations. So these are things that we most typically see come up. Elements of amenity around impacts on local residents, whether that is proximity to individual dwellings or impacts of noise or landscape impacts, etc. Impacts on setting of listed buildings, but also buried assets. And so often substantial discussion around what would comprise a proportionate approach for the purposes of determining an application on understanding archaeological assets, so on and so forth. Protected areas such as national parks, national landscapes can come up substantially, whether you're within those elements or indeed within the setting of it. Elements relating to BMV, best and most versatile land, for those that are not aware, BMV category is anything that's grade 1, 2, or 3A. So, you know, demonstrating that the applicant has sought to minimise those impacts, but bearing in mind that BMV is not a predominating factor in decision taking. And then cumulative impacts, obviously very important, particularly given that map that I showed where they're starting to see some substantial clustering of projects. And then, yeah, lastly, just on some of the other considerations. So community benefits often comes up. It's under this slide rather than the planning consideration slides because community benefits are not a planning matter. They do not directly relate to, you know, the mitigation of impacts or the enhancement of benefits. So they sit separate from the planning balance in that regard. But they do often come up, and the national grid and the availability of connections. And many of you will be aware that the availability of a grid connection is obviously a very scarce resource, and that does drive site location and delivery dates. And so it's often a key aspect to consider. I'm very happy to explore any of those aspects in more detail through Q&A if that comes up. But then just moving on to the next slide, I think the last slide actually. So yeah, then just to briefly touch on the current consultation for the National Planning Policy Framework. There's some substantial changes in there, many of which are very positive. And so, but really just to focus, of course, on the solar ones. So I think the biggest one is perhaps the proposal to increase the threshold of solar NSIPs from 50 megawatts up to 150 megawatts. That will, of course, naturally push more schemes into planning application territory rather than DCO territory. And interestingly, what you see at the moment is you see very, very few schemes coming forward between that 51 and 150 megawatt threshold because there's an increased time and cost associated with DCOs. It's quite an onerous process that an applicant would need to go through, and so therefore you tend to jump from 50 up to really quite large schemes. So it is. It's interesting to consider this as an issue. It could see more schemes come forward, but of course it could also increase the burden on local authorities, and obviously offices are already extremely busy. So I think there's some interesting pros and cons related to that proposal. There is also the proposal in the second bullet there to give significant weight to a renewable energy proposal's contribution to the overall net zero target and national aim. Again, that's certainly a positive thing from the purposes of renewables, but you know, it's noted that there's still that substantial difference with the national policy statement and the critical national priority that starts to generate. So you know, there's interesting aspects related to that as well. And then the final bullet is a bolstering of the idea of identifying suitable areas for renewables. So plans should no longer consider doing it. Plans should now simply do it if the consultation feedback is received and it's ultimately forms part of the NPPF. And so one could say that starts to create an expectation, not quite, but almost akin to what you might see as the concept for allocation of housing sites or allocation of employment sites and other aspects. For those housing and employment uses, clearly there's real benefit in allocating those sites in specific parts because of the social, economic and environmental consideration that comes with not having very small and isolated housing developments all over the place. It's interesting to consider solar, I think, against that, where solar sits largely once operational. You know, there's very minimal effects in terms of traffic coming to and from the development, and aside from the fact that there may be landscape and visual effects for the duration of the operation. There's not really much happening on that site apart from that. So and so given the kind of scarcity of grid connections, I think, it's interesting to think about the pros of having clear allocations of where sites could be located in terms of speeding up the decision-making process and providing certainty for applicants, but also the extent to which it's truly necessary once all of the other policies have been adhered to. So again, they're all really interesting proposals, but I think each one has got kind of two sides to the coin, as it were. Okay, so yeah, that was all I had just as an introductory kickoff. So Rachel.